Of course, I forgot to put an acknowledgement slide together on this. GBF has been a big supporter of research from the University of Guelph, as David was saying, since at least 2012. We've been doing work up in Parry Sound and other parts of Georgian Bay since about 2008, 2009. Started off as just egghead ecologists, academics, very happy in our little ivory tower, going out and playing in lakes and figuring out the fundamental ecology of Georgian Bay, but then rapidly realized that there's some pretty applied questions that should be addressed. One of which is aquaculture and the prospect of freshwater aquaculture. So when I thought about putting this together, I thought, okay, 15 minutes, a whole primer on the science behind aquaculture and environmental interactions, but I'm not going to be able to do that. Sorry to disappoint you if you want me to provide all of that information. What I do want to do is kind of provide a big context for this question, raise some of the concerns that surround aquaculture globally, and then narrow it down to issues that are specific to freshwater aquaculture in Georgian Bay. Take you through a few studies that have been done that address these issues, and then kind of talk about some of the future directions, because this is an issue that moving forward I believe is going to grow in profile. So the global context is we're going to have 9 billion people to feed by 2050. University of Guelph has a big project surrounding this very important issue called Food from Thought. We're kind of a small piece of that. But if you look at the way that we've been addressing this, and protein being a big piece of this, our wild capture fisheries are not going to supply this protein. And when you ask questions about where this protein comes from, you get a number of answers, believe me, facing off with undergraduate classes, from laboratory produced protein to all these different things that we can talk about. But the fact is, right now, they're either coming from farms, or they're coming from the ocean or freshwater systems, and wild capture or farmed fish. Aquaculture has been growing. The perceptions that you hear in the media are largely based on marine systems. But if, again, you take a look at this global scale, it's freshwater in the red there that is really taking off, largely in developing nations. And we've had a project going in Cambodia for about 5 years now, and the freshwater aquaculture operations in Asia are pretty impressive, from, your household net pen outside of a floating hut to very large operations in China. When you think about the issues and the concerns that people have surrounding this, well, actually, I don't have to think about it. Heidi Froelich did it for me. She was a postdoc at NCEAS, and she put together this survey, a global survey of what the concerns were surrounding aquaculture. And again, this is globally, but what you can see are the top negative associations are the effects on local wildlife, the effects on wild capture fisheries, then the cost, and then pollution, and then down through oil, parasites, disease. These are the things, again, this is what people are largely concerned about and what governments are largely concerned about. But there's also positive associations with aquaculture, and the most positive association with aquaculture is that it can be a sustainable source of protein. That it is a good, that seafood with omega-3s and all of these lovely things that we like to keep in our diets are a good source of protein, and that it provides food security. And then you work your way down the list in terms of more of the socioeconomic benefits. When we look at where Canada sits on this, actually Canada has, globally, what you see here in red is negative associations, gray is neutral associations, and blue is positive associations. Largely, globally, aquaculture is seen as a positive. And that's within the context of the previous slide of what people see as the negatives and what people see as the positives. In Canada, we actually have a more negative view than the rest of the world when it comes to aquaculture, which I find rather interesting. Freshwater aquaculture in Canada has been identified for many years as an area of potential growth. We are a freshwater nation. We identify with freshwater. We're also a farming nation, right? And aquaculture, as I'm reminded again and again from the operators, is a farming operation. It's not a fisheries operation. The same principles that apply for animal husbandry on land apply for freshwater aquaculture. The arguments for is that it could help address issues including food security, sustainability of fish harvest, and socioeconomic stability in regions that are looking for employment and are looking for economic stability. But of course, there are concerns related to the negative impacts of fish and fish culture practices. Norm Yan actually had a pretty good review of the concerns surrounding freshwater aquaculture in Canada in 2005. I don't think that the concerns have changed appreciably over the years. The effects on water quality have been mentioned. The effects on local wild fish populations. This one is one that comes up often more in the marine, but this also applies in freshwater systems, a more global thing where the feed is actually derived from wild fish. The effects of escapees, which are more of a concern, I would argue, on the West Coast, where you have something like Atlantic salmon in a Pacific environment. In Georgian Bay and up on Manitoulin, you have rainbow trout in a system that actually has naturalized rainbow trout. Rainbow trout aren't native, but they've been here for over a century. People argue that they're naturalized. There are concerns about the spread of pathogens and pharmaceutical use. That's beyond the scope of my expertise. We have people at Guelph who are kind of in the vet college who look at this type of thing, but I won't be focusing on that today, but acknowledge that it is a concern. The effects on water quality have been at the forefront of concern and at the forefront of the regulatory environment. As is shown in this picture here, which is also on the front of one of the GBF publications, phosphorus is what is considered to be the primary limiting nutrient in freshwater ecosystems, and that tends to be the focus of the regulatory framework. This was a lake up the experimental lakes area where Dave Schindler added carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus to this basin and carbon and nitrogen to that basin, and boom, everyone knows the algal bloom that took off in that lake. DFO, Ministry of Natural Resources, when they see a net pen operation or a net cage operation, they think of it from a phosphorus loading point of view. So you have your net cage right here, your food goes in and your harvest comes out. That's kind of the economic side of the phosphorus equation. This is what the fish farmers are largely concerned about. But of course you do have particulate fish waste being deposited on the bottom of the lake. You have also soluble phosphorus being released into the lake, and through leaching you've got kind of this increase in dissolved phosphorus, and that can go up to the phytoplankton and result in the increased algal growth. That's the concern. There's also the increase in phosphorus in the sediment, which could become a kind of a potential bank for future years. So one of the more extensive studies that has been done was conducted up at the experimental lakes area. Cheryl Podemsky, Mike Rennie, a whole bunch of other researchers, a huge effort where they looked at a whole lake ecosystem effect and looked at the phosphorus loading. And what they wanted to do here was they wanted to create a net pen operation that, when you took into account how much phosphorus you were putting in through feed, was equivalent to the amount of phosphorus that triggered this reaction. but just in a different form. In this study, inorganic phosphorus was dumped into the lake, and in this study, the phosphorus was put in the form of fish feed. This was a very long study where they measured before, during, and after, and they also had a couple of control lakes where they monitored the variables. What did the results say? This was actually published in 2010, very shortly after the stoppage of the net pen aquaculture. And in your upper panel here, you can see the phosphorus concentration in the aquaculture lake increasing after the establishment of the aquaculture facility. And those open symbols there are your control lakes. With that increase in phosphorus, there was also an increase in your phytoplankton concentration. So, you know, as much as you might find this hard to believe, we're really happy when things work out on a very simple manner. This is what should happen, and this is what did happen. That you get this increase in phytoplankton concentration. And then there was also a decrease in oxygen concentration directly beneath the net pen, like was predicted. Interestingly, and this happens often as well, control lakes with no net pens at all actually showed similar patterns just because of environmental effects, temperature, ice off, and the natural variation. When you look at kind of over all of the years in this study, when you look at the amount of phosphorus that went in, almost 94% went in terms of fish food, about 6.5% were the juveniles that were put in. About 43% of it sedimented out, around 26% was released by solutes, there was some loss of fish, and then the rest of that was harvested. Okay? So this is the kind of mass balance approach that you want to take when you're trying to figure out what happens to the phosphorus in these different systems. So interestingly, there was this response of increased phosphorus and increased phytoplankton, but it was nowhere near the green soup that was the response of the inorganic phosphorus addition, even though the amount of phosphorus that was going in was the same. So the question is, what happened to this phosphorus? The difference between inorganic phosphorus and organic phosphorus, of course, is that inorganic phosphorus can only be used by photosynthetic organisms like algae, whereas the organic phosphorus is available to animals. So when they looked at the response of the local wildlife, they saw that yes, there was a subsidy effect, that either the feed or the feces from these operations were subsidizing the local populations of minnows here, and you can see that the gray is where the aquaculture operation was established, and then these are the aquaculture sites, and the control sites did not change at all. Same thing with sculpin. There was an increase in sculpin population, which are a benthic fish. And then the lake trout. The lake trout populations in the aquaculture sites actually seem to respond the strongest to the presence of the aquaculture operation. And not only in numbers, but what they also saw was that the age of maturity decreased in these fish. So they were becoming sexually mature earlier because they were basically growing faster. And their condition factor, which is basically how plump they are, increased as well. And when you think about this, it's not terribly surprising. These cage operations are pretty much like bird feeders with very, very, very high quality food, right? The food that is designed to be fed to fish in the cages is designed to make them grow fast, grow healthy, and you know, it's just densely packed with nutrition. And a lake trout in a lake is going to be able to sense that there's this food source there, and they're going to be drawn to it, and then they're going to mature earlier, have more offspring, and as a result, have increased populations. So this was a very contained study, right? This was one cage that had 10,000 fish in a small lake with a sample size of 1. So one of the things that we wanted to do when we thought about this study and when we were approached both by GBF and by the Ontario Aquaculture Association, first of all by Gord Cole from Depot Harbor, is what are there similar effects in kind of natural operations? So we did this pilot study up in Depot Harbor near Parry Sound, where we looked at the effects of that cage operation on the local fish populations. We use this biotracer approach where we use stable isotope analysis and fatty acid analysis. It's a neat little thing that we use where you can take samples from the environment, and because when it comes to stable isotopes and fatty acids, you are what you eat, we can detect in tissue samples from natural populations whether they have been feeding on a subsidy that's coming from the net pen operations. And we looked at the effect of the operation on the local ecosystem kind of structure and function. And the idea was that, we could have 3 hypotheses here. One, that the feed and the waste just sinks to the bottom of the lake and nothing eats it and nothing takes it up and we can't detect anything. Unlikely, but that's our null hypothesis. There's an asymmetric enrichment hypothesis where there are certain elements of the food web that preferentially take up this subsidy, or there's kind of this diffuse enrichment hypothesis where everything in the food web takes up the subsidy from these net pens. And what we found was the support for what we call the asymmetric enrichment hypothesis, which basically means that the open water fish seem to be benefiting from this subsidy from the aquaculture site. And this is just shown, this is the effect on lake trout up here. The black bar here is the aquaculture site, and we had 3 different types of controls. And then the black bar here showing that Cisco also benefited from the subsidy, but when we went into the near shore and looked at nearshore fish, like yellow perch, there was no evidence of a subsidy in the near shore. And that was using the stable isotope analysis. We found corroborating evidence from the fatty acid analysis where lake trout in aquaculture sites did show a different signature than non-aquaculture sites, so that corroborated the stable isotopes. The same thing with the Cisco being different from non-aquaculture sites, but then the yellow perch from aquaculture and non-aquaculture sites had virtually identical signatures. That's kind of a summary of some of the research that has been done specifically on freshwater aquaculture. There hasn't been a lot done in Ontario, which is why it's important that GBF and now the federal government, we've got an NSERC CRD, and it looks like the Westin Foundation is going to be supporting research in the region for the next 2 years in a very, very big project to see how we can take the results of this work, both the experimental work and our initial study in Parry Sound, and expand it up into these sites. And as David mentioned, we were up in these sites all summer. We just haven't analyzed the samples yet. There's a lot of fish and a lot of freezers across campus that we've got to go through. But we're going to be up here for, it looks like, at least the next 2 years, really studying these sites and really gaining insights, not just through the stable isotopes and the fatty acids, but through the barcoding technology, because up until this point, we've been limited kind of by the resources, the money to support this research. It's expensive to get up there. My God, our gas bills for boats were incredible this summer, let alone feeding a field crew of young, hungry people. It looks like we'll be able to get up here and really get a good picture of what's going on. Because, as has been mentioned, we have to figure out what management practices are best. Right? There are potential negative impacts of freshwater aquaculture. There are potential positive impacts of freshwater aquaculture. And what we want to do is manage the industry in such a way as to maximize the positives and minimize the negatives. And I think that's probably what will form the foundation of the discussion today, is how do we do that? How do we approach this problem? With issues such as the placement of operations or the management strategies like feeding regimes, harvest regimes, fallowing, these types of issues. And then the other thing that we're going to have to determine is what are our acceptable thresholds. I have a brother who's he's a business guy. He's never understood my kind of ecological leanings, but we do agree on one thing. And he said, you know what, when any issue like this comes up, there's two questions that you have to ask if you're going to move forward with the management strategy. One, how do we know if we're wrong? And two, who gets to make that call? And if we can figure out those two things, this threshold, how will we know if what we're doing is damaging to the environment? And two, who gets to make that call, I think will be closer to a sustainable industry in freshwater aquaculture. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave.